Sean's working through some of the presentation right now.
Came down and said this is on a volume that doesn't have permanent storage or something. But
Can I ask a quick question? Are we running through something, because the doors normally open at noon, so I need to let people know if are we going to run through?
Like one
Yes, we can do that.
Oh, awesome. Sorry,
Is
I
this,
made it clear.
no wait, are
This
these
is the presentation.
for today? Okay, so I'll go do
sorry.
that.
The speech is okay, I think. I mean, the one for tonight is fine.
Okay, great. And then, Sean, are we running through her presentation again? Or?
yeah, well, she added some things that she wanted to check. So we're in the process of her computer froze.
Okay.
In the process of trying to get this going. But yeah, we might need to delay
About 5 minutes or so?
something.
Wangechi, how long do you think it will take you to go through?
I'm not going through it, I'm just trying to.
We'll leave you hanging here.
It's not going through, it's just.
Oh, so you don't need it on
7,
the screen.
okay.
You do want it.
So it's not letting me eject that something is using it.
Okay.
Can we close this window since
Close
it's
it.
not saved?
Yeah, close it, I see.
Says,
Just get out, yeah.
all right. Just want to make sure before we close anything that you're working on.
No.
I love your
Thank you, they're my big parachute skirt.
See, now there's no permit. Let's see if it's that.
Finder is using it. Maybe we can just get us through the sign.
Nick, I think we're going to need at least 5 more minutes. We're doing a run. We're finishing up a run.
He's going to shut the whole computer down.
Yes. It's not mine.
How are you doing? Okay.
I wish this was, I wish I, it's okay though. The speech one is fine.
Okay, and I will get that printed,
Yeah.
and I'll be back.
That is,
So this USB.
yeah. Mine does.
So the sound is all set in the cafe, correct?
Yeah, but we should probably turn it on. That's going to have to go through with the video. So
Want
we're
me to
going
go
in there.
flip it off?
Hit the button that says call.
Right.
It's not coming out.
Okay.
That's funny. And when you go to this, it'll go back. Great.
I wonder if I want that. Can I just delete that last image? Just to finish all of my thoughts. Thank you very much. Ready or not. You're so kind. Thank you. So I'll get this out of the way and I'm gonna get my computer.
Yeah, she's behind me.
And I'm standing there, it's all about ripping me. You know, I'm standing there going, I stood there for 20 minutes with my mom. And when she got done, she sat down. You know, it was amazing.
This is the first time I meet you.
Oh, yeah, no, my life never ceases to smile. But I mean, she was literally 20 amazing.
You know, I didn't eat much of my avocado. Teal? Like recently saturated. Yeah. Guacamole.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Just one.
Good, how are you?
What's happening?
I know, I know. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Up until yesterday, he was still telling me 10%.
I didn't win last year, but this year did. I'm excited. Thank you. your seats. Yes. 5 minutes. Just about to make the.
Okay, so who do I count?
Check, check. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday Featured Artist Lecture with Wangechi Mutu. We will be starting our event in about 5 minutes. If you have a seat in the hall, please make your way in that direction. Thank you. Okay.
Oh my goodness, welcome. Have you been here before?
I'm just learning my way around.
Hi. Yeah, yeah. I haven't seen her, but I haven't been at the door the whole time, evidently you are now in National Council guest. Not sure quite how that happened, but I'm sure you have a good negotiator. Hey Sean.
Hello, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
Awesome.
No, she didn't go to that. Okay, so you just need to turn on mic A, right?
Yeah, brah.
And then I'm on. Okay. Alright.
Check out the live control room, shall we? Ooh, good. Our stream is good.
Got that good.
Bang, good.
I'm gonna make one more announcement.
And Nancy's got the black mic. Yep.
Is that thing on? Yeah. What's going on, buddy?
I just realized. There we go.
Oh yeah, I've done that before, not plugging that back in.
I was like, oh, the remote's in here, and then I was like, oh.
Second row on the right. Oh well.
that Lico is on and good.
Oh. Good call, man.
And I'm gonna kill all these other lights except for obviously that one, right?
Yes.
You doing alright? I ain't gonna stop you.
Just click through the
I'm sure there'd be
slides.
a couple people that would try it out.
So I have the volume set to where we agreed upon. Yes. Yes. And if you want to change it, you can use the remote or you can signal me with like an up or down.
Is the remote over there or?
It's at the podium.
Here, I can show you if you want to see it. It's back.
Yeah, she did it the other day.
Okay.
They're getting there.
Rolling in nicely. Yeah, there's always gonna be a couple of songs around all night.
Sean,
Yes.
can you make an announcement that the program's about to begin? Please take your seats.
Yep.
Ready? Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Featured Arts Lecture Series with Wangechi Mutu. Our event will start in just a moment, so please take your seats. Thank you.
What is with wireless? I just replaced that
Go
battery.
back.
Yeah, it might be malfunctioning or something.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hey, you're here. All right. I'm Dennis Scholl, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this really special presentation by Wangechi Mutu. But before we start with today's speaker, and before I introduce her, can we acknowledge a minute the hardest working staff in the West, I would say, who have brought us all this incredible discourse this summer. I just wake up Thursday morning so psyched to get here and hear everybody. So it's been an amazing summer once again, and it only is getting better. So tonight, Wangechi, along with Jan and Ronnie and Ann, Wangechi's receiving the National Artists Award at our 21st anniversary annual recognition dinner. And of course, she's been at the ranch for a couple days. We got to hang out a little bit. She spent time with artists. She went through the painting studio. Yesterday, we had to drag her out. There were people hanging on her to get, selfies, the whole thing. I mean, And I think everybody knows that she is one of the most important and significant artists of our time. Her work crosses mediums, including collage, video, performance, and recently some pretty kick-ass sculptures in her last show. So I'm excited about that. Now, they gave me a whole bunch of stuff to say here, and as you can see, I just showed Sue, I crossed it all out. I'm not going to say any of that. Instead, Wangechi's going to kill me. Instead, I thought I would tell the story about how Wangechi and I first met. So we were at some art world soiree, and I looked across the room. There's this regal woman, headdress. She came right at me, and she got right up in my face, and she said, "You make wine." And I said, "Yes, I do." And that inner voice said to me, "Wow, she knows I make wine." Then she said, "I need bottles." And I said, "Sure." And that inner voice said, "Not only does she know I make wine, she likes my wine." And I said to her, "Gee, I've got to get them from the distributor, it'll take a little while." She goes, No. She goes, "I don't want the wine. I just need bottles. I'm doing a show, and I've got this thing where I want these bottles turned upside down." So anyway, like a good patron, the next day I had 48 magnums of empty wine bottles delivered to her, for which she did a beautiful installation, of course. And the rest is history. I licked my wounds for about 2 weeks, I'll be honest. Are you sure that you don't want to try the wine at some point? I mean, I'd appreciate it. So. Now, before turning over the microphone to her, I want to thank one of America's greatest art patrons who's here today, and my friend, Toby Devin Lewis, who's our presenting sponsor. Please join me in thanking her. And we also want to thank everybody else. There's a lot of people helping with this project who are making the event possible, including the National Council, who does so much for this organization, corporate and media sponsors, and actually everybody here that supports the important mission of the ranch. So without further ado, let me welcome Wangechi Mutu. Okay, thank you.
Later.
Gonna try the wine.
I am. Hi, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I'm going to thank people this evening at the dinner. I'm going to thank you as I see you along. I've been so well treated, and it's just been a pleasure to come back to Anderson Ranch. So thank you for the entire staff that has made this possible. Thank you to Sean and Patrick and the AV people who were so patient with me, and Ashley, thank you as well. Dennis, thank you for that very sweet introduction. And you'll be happy to know I'm actually doing this wine piece again in Cape Town this fall in September at the opening of the Zeitz Mocha. So I'm going to try something different, and bear with me because you're my guinea pigs, but I think it's a good place for artists to experiment. It's been a while since I did a talk, and also a talk like this, and I'm going to show some new work, but I'm actually going to read the whole talk. My father built a dream for me, a dream he never rendered himself, a thing he tried to shape for all my 3 siblings. He and my small, hard-working mother are from the hills of Nyeri, a very green, very cool, very lush part of the country that we're all from, Kenya. Formerly part of the British East Africa, and prior to that, a place of over 42 distinct languages and ethnicities, Kenya sits smack on the equator on the eastern part of Africa. This year, on December 12th, Kenya will be 54 years old. I think my mother has clothes in her closet that are older than that. I'm the second of the 4 children. She, my mother, is the second of 10. All but 2 are still alive. 1, a twin of my aunt who died at birth. The other, the last born, who died of a brain tumor at the age of 3 in 1971. All my mother's siblings, with the exception of the oldest, a boy, completed their education, and most of them went to university. They're all children of the war. Even the youngest was born way before independence during the emergency years. The state of emergency was declared by the then governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, due to the Mau Mau rebellion. This rebellion took place almost exclusively in the highlands of central Kenya, where my parents are from. So all my grandparents who were born out of this deeply coveted green land in the shadow of Mount Kenya during a time of tremendous turmoil raised their families through the drastic transition, the birth of our nation, the arrival of the Presbyterian Church, the British administration who came to set up posts so as to begin the settlement onto our land with their people, the English people. My grandfather was hardworking and learned how to drive early and really, really well. He was rarely home during those long, difficult years. He built his fortune driving trucks all over East Africa for tourists and for transportation of goods. My grandmother, enterprising and diligent, was never idle, and it was she who raised all of these babies almost entirely on her own. Eventually, she converted to Christianity to be able to visit the clinic, to go to school, to avoid the suspicion and the cruel life of being considered a Mau Mau sympathizer, or perhaps even worse, a heathen. Prior to this, she'd undergone the obligatory rite of passage to womanhood, circumcised as a young pubescent girl in the preparation for marriage. My shosho, my grandmother, also had her earlobes pierced and stretched to fit the wide, beautiful traditional earrings. When she chose the church over Kikuyu life, she had the dangly loop skin of her ears sewn back. In those days, there wasn't much anesthesia, and I often wonder what hurt more, the incision of the knife to cut the hole for her stretched earlobes, or the small, precise slicing of her clitoris, or perhaps the cutting and stitching up of her earlobes back to something the British would no longer consider primitive. All in all, I come from a line of serious, strong, stubborn women. Each of them made decisions to ultimately survive through movement, through hard work, and by changing as they took along their families and their skill wherever they went. All the way from Shosho Ani, my great-grandmother, Ani, who pretended she was baptized and took on this very English name. She never actually respected the unwise and unknowable British land grabbers. From Shosho Ani to my maternal grandmother, Wadira, who insisted on going to school and learning how to drive and converting to the new religion. And then my mother, the nurse, the midwife, the gardener, and the healer. My mother was accepted to nursing school in Athens. Afraid to travel that far away from her family, she settled for Uganda, where she completed her training and returned home to her newly independent, slightly volatile, small country and her new husband, my dad. I've been pressed from the many motivated matriarchs who knew that progress came through a willingness to move, adjust, and survive with swift and safe motion through time and unfamiliar landscapes. My mother still remembers as a child, who was constantly playing second mother to her siblings. She still remembers having to pick up and relocate to the villages, as they call them, concentration camps where Kikuyu families were trapped and surveyed. They took with them all they could carry, but they had very few things to take. But they had to leave many things behind. The eldest people, the ones who held the greatest of our knowledge, our oral culture and traditional ways, they didn't survive. They were unable to move fast enough, if at all. Almost all who were taken along died from the cold and unfamiliar housing given to the interned families. Soon, the fight for self-determination would take shape, and out of the population of new, young leaders in our nascent nation, a group who could lead the country into independence emerged. So, moving forward, past independence, past the early 70s when I was born and into the 1980s, and I find myself contemplating my life as a creative young woman whose academics could certainly get her into good schools, but who yearns for something I simply cannot define or find in my home country. After playing the principal role in a major play at my Catholic school, I was presented the idea of an alternative path towards completing my education. I ended up going to school for 2 years in Wales and emerged unashamedly aware that I was an artist. When I returned to Nairobi, I was offered a job at an old fort in the northernmost point on the coast of Kenya, a small island town called Lamu, where I was working as the main muralist and designer of one of the rooms for a museum of the environment, a really strange choice in a fort building that had stood as an armory, a prison, a monument to the presence of early Portuguese and Oman traders from the Middle East. Nevertheless, the Swedish government had offered a lot of funding for this environmental museum, and so the project proceeded. In Lamu, my days are filled with the work of mixing egg tempera with organic colors that are non-toxic and unprotected from the mold and fungus of a humid, tropical climate. Everything I paint turns into a shade of moldy gray within days of application. I'm determined not to rot there too, so I begin to apply to schools that offer art degrees, only to realize how far I have to move to accomplish these dreams and hopes. One particular day, after a long night of writing and drawing and working, I hear the clamor and the clang of the farm handlers. I decided to go out into the pitch black night to find out what the noise was all about. To my surprise, I find the young men standing over a long snake whose only crime is to be a legless animal in a culture fearful of snakes, in spite of how common they are. I beg them to stop pounding at his head, since the poor animal looks perfectly lifeless, sitting long and battered in the grass. They agree to go to bed and leave the sad remains till morning time. As would have it, in the morning, on my way to work, I encounter something seriously strange. The animal who the night before lay lifeless and beaten was no longer where we'd left him. So I looked for him, but I was running late, and I had edible paints to mix and murals to complete at the fort. I leave the snake, finding task till after work. Upon my return home from the fort, I asked the farm guys if they have any idea where this young reptile has gone. They walked me over to see, and it turns out the poor animal and his pounded head had tried to crawl away and move across to another spot in the garden where he finally lay motionless, possibly even more dead than the night before. I hatch a marvelous idea. To prevent the creature from resurrecting again, and also to preserve the remains of this most beautiful body, I decide we must skin the poor thing. Having never skinned a snake in my life, and knowing my only help was to come from a pair of squeamish, snake-fearing farm guys, I proceed with caution and an inflated sense of confidence. How else could I possibly justify explaining such a ridiculous task? We proceed to cut off the head of this unlucky animal, and then split the skin down the belly, following some unknown snake skinning formula that all of a sudden I'm keenly aware of. After much cutting and scraping and separating and removal of flesh from the membrane, we discard and burn the meat, and then further clean the skin. Again, no one knows anything about snake skinning, and the task was to preserve the animal's beautiful outer covering. I just want to know, can you hear my voice above the video sound? Oh, great, good. The next and final activity is the most important one, and it almost carries a spiritual significance, even though I'm not sure why. We find a wide wooden board and begin to nail the soggy piece of skin onto it until all 6 foot 5 inches of him is pinned down like some peculiar sacrilegious crucifixion. This encounter with the snake that got stoned, the one that wouldn't die, and then the decapitation and the skinning never left my psyche. According to the homeowners, the aliveness of this specimen continues as his badly skinned skin continues to rot and smell for weeks and months after he's been stretched and nailed. But I leave Lamu soon after this ritual and head to school to New York City, but not before the local women have properly embraced and amused me with their stories of sea creatures, nguvas, sirens of the ocean, and the goat-footed women they disguise themselves as in the daytime, walking and haunting the streets of this little ancient boat village. After all the schooling and the living, it takes me many years to properly remember and exhume these memories of the snake head, the genie women, the temptress, the henna-covered brides and their ululating relatives. But some point in my career, it does come back to me. The biblical serpent that tempted Eve, that stood for human curiosity and doubt, was the instigator to the banishment and the cursing of women. This ritual I had clumsily enacted became a symbol of my search for knowledge and autonomy. That very incident became a metaphor for the banishment that I would receive for this search and shamelessness. Many of the stories and the memories of my childhood return to me in random order, sometimes threatening to undo reality, but constantly I'm inspired to create unrealities and surrealities in the form of majestic paintings cobbled together with watercolor and photography. I'm freed by my flight from home, from my paradise life in Lamu, from the garden. But this self-banishment allows me to be magnificently untethered for years to come, and magnificently unconnected. For subtext, this is one of the only videos that I tend to show on the ground, and projected onto a sheet of paper, which also sits on sort of these pylons. So it's a very kind of earthy, grounded piece, and I wanted it to read as such, both visually and in terms of the way it's placed. It was made at a very particular time, again, when I wasn't able to travel, and I was working on videos, thinking a lot about place and time, and trying to figure out a way to make the scenery feel completely unlike Brooklyn or New York. In case you know Prospect Park, this is actually the little lake in Prospect Park. One of my favorite moments in art school was studying this sort of syncretic art histories and practices of Haitian voodoo and Catholicism, of candomblé and Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian traditions, and thinking a lot about how these motifs of and this iconography of Catholicism has sort of fed into these cultures vis-a-vis the Africans who had been brought over. And there's such a beautiful preservation of those cultures and at the same time a complete distortion of them. So in many ways I see a lot of the female icons that I create as part of a singular project to recreate the Virgin Mary, which sort of followed me and oppressed me throughout my 12 years of Catholic school. So I've done a lot of work and research on these primal deities of pre-Christian culture in all different places, the Maori, the Sheila Nagigs of the Irish, a lot of motifs that connect the image of fertility and motherhood and voluptuousness and fecundity with the ultimate God. So I call this the God is female times, and I'm kind of very interested in that moment because something shifts when Christianity turns Mary into a virgin, and the icon becomes a completely sanitized, young, and completely unattainable ideal. And that's actually, I guess, the point with Mary, is that it's something that no one can ever reach. This virgin birth of God is a completely unique occurrence. So with Eat Cake, I'm bringing together these repulsive and at the same time erotic insinuations of these deities and also of women who are idealized, both for negative traits as well as their absolute magnificence and incomprehensibility. So I've used the heels that are used. They're basically hooker heels or stripper heels, and this massive mound of a cake to represent feeding, a ritual, to represent greed. Sweetness. I'll let it play till the end, so those of you who haven't seen it can get an idea of what it is. And this end is one of cleansing and completion in the water. It is this narrative that I'm going to start one paragraph back. Many of the stories and memories of my childhood return me in random order, sometimes threatening to undo reality, but constantly I'm inspired to create unrealities and surrealities in the form of majestic paintings cobbled together with watercolor and photography. In my search for home and my thinking about home, I also thought about the idea of homelessness as part of the migrant and the immigrant's reality. But I also thought about ways of depicting in very simple, very particularly choreographed moments, a sense of anxiety that cobble together these different moments in history, both personal and public. This particular street is in the Navy Yard area. It's an area full of artist studios and a lot of creative folks in Brooklyn. And my sculpture studio was there for a number of years. The idea of protest and creativity for me have come closer and closer together with the years. And in some cases, I feel like performance allows me to enact things that give the flame to the sort of rage and the passion that I feel about different kinds of issues, including my own personal circumstances. But in this case, I was very much thinking about protests and the way we move and behave in moments of anxiety and urgency and desperation. And obviously, in this case, this woman is singular and in some ways is enacting the role of a sort of a destitute woman. But this kind of throwing I see so often in times when people are at a tipping point. And for lack of a better expression, they use this motion of picking up a rock or an item and throwing it in order to express their ultimate rage. This particular piece was made in some ways as an homage to the Iraqi who threw shoes at the then President of the US, George W. Bush. It finally happens, and suddenly, after years of longing, after so much saudade and discussions of my melancholy, that I'm finally able to return to that place of my upbringing, collecting my fragments, my new family, my basket of spells and supplies. I begin to head back to the great continent, to the city and the grasslands, to father's unrequited dreams, to the red soil, black cotton, and petrified wood. I begin to make the rippling skin of the sculpted rust-colored bodies mimicking keloids formed upon scarification, a condition only found in melanated skin. I use roots retrieved from my neighbor's garden, pebbles, crystals, beads, and seeds, feathers, glass, the stringy twigs. They're all part of this new chapter where Brooklyn and Langata speak to each other in a harmonious new history of art making, extending the journey which I started way back when. Actually going to bring the volume up. After many years of making collage using photographic material and my own invented process of mixing watercolor and paint, I really wanted to see some of these paintings in motion, the way I see them in my head when I'm creating them. And so the motivation behind actually working with animation and hiring someone to sit by me as I created these animated vignettes of what essentially was collage-based work was to try to see and understand what this painting would look like over a period of time. And in this case, one of the central images that we used and kind of brought to life literally and digitally was my tumor series, these big, wonderful, round collage paintings that were filled with all kinds of images, grafted and cut and spliced into the circle, legs and vegetation and machinery and festering and explosive sort of elements and ideas, some of which again are from magazines, others sort of creating the illusion of a wound or a blister or a volcano. So from the time I started the tumor series, which in fact I showed, I think, from one of the first times I showed was at the Museum of Museum of Art in Miami, MAM, to this, it was about a 10-year period. But the wonderful thing was that the ideas carried through. So what I had tried to express in the tumor series actually came out and came through in this kind of format. I think there's also, for me at this point, an engagement with the environment as a symbol and a metaphor for our own existence. And whereas I previously focused primarily on the female body and the diseases of the female body as a metaphor for larger issues and so forth, in this case I was really thinking about nature. And how it reflects who we are, and in fact that nature is us, and everything that is happening on Earth and happening in how we process and remove resources and mine the Earth has so much to do with how we are actually treating ourselves and our neighbors and the people around us, and of course all the other animals that share this planet with us. I've used this idea of this disembodied, this head, this floating head, kind of separated from its body, as a symbol of being cut off from one's past, one's history, or one's consciousness. But I think in this case, I was actually interested in a sort of a positive and in a kind of a euphoric outcome after the previous chapter. A lot of these images have followed through into the sculpture. In some ways are very subtle manner, in other ways they're more obvious. There's also this feeling of multitudes and plurality and conversation in this particular part of the film that I think is something that I hope for and yearn for in terms of resolving some of the world's issues as we see them. And this is the second dreamer. It's a self-portrait which I began actually very soon after graduate school, around 2002, 2003, in the form of a clay work, which was never completed, and was able to finally complete it in bronze in the last couple of years. And this is actually the last image. So thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, we have a mic in the audience, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait for the mic.
I was interested in, thank you very much. It was fascinating, and I appreciate all your wonderful work. And I was particularly interested in your use of sound and what that represents for you.
So there's several different ways I go about it. In the performance works where I'm performing, or there's a live woman performing, it's all it's all real sound, and then I graphed on it what I think the narrative. Obviously, there are two different ones. Eat Cake, where the character is eating this mound of cake, has swan sounds, but they're exaggerated and they're elongated, and it has water sounds. I think in that one particular, in that particular day, in the editing of that piece, one of the things that we try to do is create this sense that it was a sort of a timeless space. We didn't know when in history it was, or what particular time it was. So I think I really sort of distorted the sound in that one. In Shushu, I recorded the sound as it was, and I pretty much kept it. It may have been sort of amplified in some way, so you hear the scraping of her cart and the shoes as they hit the ground, and then eventually a little bit of the sort of heaving of her breath as she throws the shoes. I think that one you can sort of see that it captures what seems like a more kind of a real moment as opposed to sort of a surreal one. I mean, I guess sound in the end is, it goes with the narrative and the image and what I'm trying to get out of it. The more animated ones are very dreamlike, and we've grafted so many different kinds of sounds. And for example, the end of eating everything, this is not sound related, but one of the things that we had a hardest time doing was finding a way to make her seem like she was biting something that bled. And so, being that I work with ink, we came up with a solution to just use ink dropping into water. And then as a result of doing that, we sort of decided to twist everything. So even the way she seems to wail when she's about to bite into the birds is completely fabricated. And it's sort of trying to find a sound that is unlike anything you've ever seen, because she's sort of unlike anything I've ever seen. Question there. Thanks for your question.
It was really a moving presentation. Thank you so much, Wangechi. I have a question about during a moment of, I would say, a profound, exuberant African American art being made today in the United States, and a certain awareness of that. What's your connection to the African American art that's being made today and the artists that are involved?
My connection, hopefully, is like everyone else's, is a connection of awareness, a connection of true engagement with what my colleagues and my friends are doing. I always say that I grew into my identity as a black person in the United States. I was African, I was Kenyan, I was Kikuyu, I was a woman, I was all these things. I was an artist before living in the United States. And I think one of the most privileged things about the conversations I've had with my black friends who are artists, in particular artists and intellectuals, is that it gave me the opportunity to understand and learn the history of colonization and slavery in America from a very personal perspective. But to stay authentic with where I come from, I do come from a small country that is a majority black country, with a whole set of other issues that have more to do with colonization vis-a-vis settlement. And it's a younger history of colonization too, in comparison to the United States and a lot of the Africans who were moved here. So I'm deeply engaged with a lot of people's work, especially people who have the capacity to speak from the heart about the issues that they're experiencing in terms of oppression, in terms of prejudice and so forth, and somehow their work is able to communicate to everyone and at the same time stay close to those very painful histories and personal experiences, which we often all have if we are not the mainstream or part of the power structure. So it's kind of a complicated question to ask me, but it's a fair question, and I think I'm very moved by my friends who have dedicated themselves to thinking about what's happening in the United States right now, especially there's so much upheaval, but throughout the United States history, and And so I follow, I read, I talk, I think, I work with them, but I also understand my own position and my flexibility and my deficits in understanding the experience because I wasn't born here, and how that actually adds a new element to my work. There's a kind of an entire part of my brain that was raised outside of racism in the United States, which is in some ways a huge privilege, but at the same time, not really, because we all should understand what's happening. So I'm very proud of my friends who've, I'm proud of Sanford Biggers and Hank Willis and Rashad and all these people who've really worked to make art a big part of their lives, but at the same time are constantly engaging with the politics, and their work is still very interesting, and they're empowered, and they're successful. They have voices. I think all of that makes the work even more vital.
Hi, thank you. You're so well-spoken and thoughtful, and yet your art is wild. And I wonder how you get your mind into the state that you create these unique and wonderful images. For example, what was going on in your mind when you were eating cake?
So what was going on in my mind when I was eating cake was I was very interested in what I said earlier, which is this idea that the icons that we worship, that we consider to be the most lauded and beautiful, and there's I always want to mess with what that means and why we worship things, why we choose particular kinds of images to represent all of us, and when we're all so different. So that's the first thing I'm thinking, is how do I shake up this this central image in my work is most often a black woman or a woman of color or any variation of that kind of thing mixed with many different things. So I rarely represent these women typical and realistically. I think there's a slight amount of mother anxiety at that moment. I remember when I made the film, I think I just had one of my girls, and there is this thing about feeding and fecundity and fertility mixed with things you can't control, because you're feeding another creature and you're also having to feed, and you're tired and you're ecstatic, and there's a little bit of that in there too. I'm certainly thinking about wealth and affluence and being very fortunate and what that means, especially coming from a poor country, how that plays up against that background of my country, how much people earn, what people do for a living. I've made quite a few performances in films thinking about women's labor and work as an actual art, as an actual creative act, as an actual act of defiance. And I think in this case I'm thinking about the fortune of being an artist and being a successful artist is also that there are others who aren't. There's only a few of us who are picked to do this work and allowed to do it the way we do it for whatever reason. And I don't always think it's about talent or it's not always the best ones. It is sometimes bringing together of different reasons and circumstances and so forth. So I think I'm also thinking about what does that mean to have more than you can eat. And I think in both works, The End of Eating Everything and in Eat Cake, you get the sense of fullness, but illness all at the same time, sort of a kind of a pathological greed, which is also me translating all of these things that I see around me. So I'm not a linear thinker, which is, I speak linear, probably that's what you're seeing the difference between my images and how I speak. It's possible to do both, but I don't think at all linear, so I'm always grabbing things like sort of in this constellation of my mind, and my challenge is actually how to bring them together and make them cohesive, which has always been something that I've enjoyed doing. In some cases I do really well.
One more question.
Great. Wangechi, could you share with us a little bit about what you're doing to combine your art with activism in East Africa?
Not much yet, to be quite honest, but I am the founder of Africa's Out.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I did about 2.5 years ago was work with an organization that came to me at a time when there was 2 laws that were beginning to criminalize homosexuality in Nigeria and Uganda. And I think the Nigerian law actually went through and it passed as an actual law. I don't know exactly, no, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not privy to the language, but it was a very kind of frightening thing to imagine this law that basically stated that if you did these things in privacy of your life and your house, you could actually be arrested and punished. So this organization came to me because they said, Uganda's about to pass the law, what do we do? And I said, this is not only horrible for gay people, this is horrible for everybody, because the minute you start to take laws and turn them into these things that can judge people for what is going on inside of them, it has nothing to do with their criminal background or their ethical capacities, it's a very dangerous place to go. But on top of that, I really wanted to do something that meant that the art that we all do as artists can push this sort of engines that are already in motion, engines of change for human rights, for equal rights, for gay rights, for Black Lives Matter. All of these things are out there, but sometimes creativity does something really wonderful to spin the images and actually ignites the empathy in people. So what I decided to do was just create a big party because I wanted to make sure that we sort of encircled anybody who felt threatened, especially gay creative Africans. But also, in a weird way, I wanted to shame the people who thought that it was okay to think that there's something wrong about being gay and African or being different and African. And so Africa's Out, which has got a butterfly emblem, is about the idea of letting these issues out, of supporting people for what they're doing, especially if what they're doing is helping society rather than harming it. So I'm specifically interested in creative Africans and creative people in general and artists, because I think we have something magical about the way we go about things, and that's the only way I know how to operate is through my art mind. But now the thing that Africa's Out is focused on is that we're doing residencies. So we are actually, we've got our second resident coming to New York actually in a couple of months. Lerato from South Africa is going to do a residency both in New York and upstate New York at Denniston Hill. We're sharing it with Julie Meretu's residency. And I'm kind of thinking about it a little bit like the airlift JFK kind of idea, where Pan-African idealism, which was basically if we bring African students to America, and if we bring American students to the continent, the conversation it will spark will actually be so beneficial for both communities. And obviously it is. It's given the United States a president, as many people. My father was one of the kids who was brought to the United States. Wangari Maathai, who's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, was one of these people who was sort of airlifted. So the idea of the butterfly is something that can transform how culture and art can affect change is a very big part of what we're doing as Africa's Out.
One final question, quick one.
Hi, I love your country of Kenya, and I've been very fortunate to have been there 3 times. In fact, just recently in November, and I spent a weekend in Nairobi, and it's changing so much. And I'm just curious, with you having left and maybe coming, I believe at lunch somebody said they thought you were maybe going back to Kenya to live full-time. I'm curious to know I could see this wonderful sort of development, and we saw lots of shops, and I'm just curious what other kind of cultural experiences you feel like Kenya is experiencing beyond just, the growth of the country. It's a wonderful country. It's so nice to hear your presentation.
Thank you. No, I think one of the things that I'm really trying to work on right now is the thing I always dreamed of, which is to be a global artist. I always wanted to, I love being a New Yorker, but I always wanted to be somewhere else as well. So my New York studio is open and I work there, but I have a Nairobi studio now. One of the best things about working in Nairobi is that it's serene, it's beautiful. It's a little bit like Aspen. It's actually quite magnificent. Every day is a beautiful day. But I think the choice to be there, to make work there, is honestly driven by the fact that I wanted to focus on the work more, and I wanted to focus on being a mom more, and I didn't want to give up one for the other. And I feel like in New York I can do the art part of my life really well, and I think that's actually why I love being there, is that everything is amplified and moves and it's accelerated and you get things done and you meet people and it's just complete, it's like no other place. And I love New Yorkers, and Brooklyn is a big part of kind of my I'm not sure what's happening in Kenya entirely, because I tend to be very focused on my work when I'm there. I visit a few things here and there. I just know it's not as developed as obviously as a lot of cities that have contemporary art scenes and curators and art historians and people who actually give a lot of attention to contemporary artists, not artisans and not, people who make, tourist art, but, serious art. But my main focus has been my art and my family. So wherever I am, that's what I try to put the emphasis on. But I think I'm less interested in talking about being in one place or another than really just making the work and the connections happen, which is what I've always tried to do. Even when I couldn't travel, I think I try to imagine myself somewhere else for that very reason.
Please join me in thanking Wangechi Mutu. Like a performance piece.
I know. It's a little different.